Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Career Conversations, where today we're discussing part-time working. I'm joined by Jennifer from the NCI Careers team. Hello Jennifer, good to speak to you again, and we're discussing the idea or the topic of part-time working, part-time careers, changing jobs in a part-time arena. What do we think are the kind of main things, the main challenges, I suppose, that people are looking at in this area?
So this is an interesting area, and there's loads of different, I guess, topics that we can kind of talk around with part-time career changes. So I think maybe it might just be helpful to kind of call out the different situations that people might be in when they're looking at part-time work, and then we can kind of discuss them. So there's going to be the situation where perhaps you are in a full-time role and you're looking to go part-time, and maybe that's because you want to study or because you have family commitments and you're looking to see whether you can essentially cut down some of your job and make it a part-time role. And there's the other situation of maybe you've been out of work for a while and you're trying to get back into the workplace, but you don't want to go full-time because you still have other commitments and things that you might be doing. So you're trying to go back into a part-time job. Perhaps you have done a degree course or something to get back into the market after an extended absence, and you're looking for, again, part-time work, but within a kind of different field than maybe what you've worked in full-time previously. So I think that they're all quite different situations. I think probably for the students in NCI, we've got people who might be kind of career transitioning, more so, who maybe have decided to come back to the workplace and have done a course in order to sort of update their own skill sets or get a bit more qualifications before trying to re-enter, and are looking for that part-time work. So maybe that will be the kind of arena that we discuss in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think maybe one of the challenges then, that maybe the thing to start talking about, is just what are maybe the key things to think about when you're going into part-time work. And from a mindset perspective, how to kind of assess, well, I want to do part-time work, how is that really going to work? I think that would probably be one of the main challenges.
Yeah, and we've spoken about this before in terms of what is important and how you would go about doing that, and making sure that you kind of have clearly defined boundaries. Is, I don't know if that's the right word, but you clearly defined areas of, like, yeses and nos in terms of your work when it comes to a part-time role. And I've kind of worked on very few part-time roles actually when I was doing recruitment. I do remember specifically one person who was going for a part-time CISO role, which is like Chief Information Security Officer, so it's a very senior role, and they did actually find this role in the end. And but I was very interested to kind of understand how that would work, and knowing the person who got the role, they're very well respected, very high achieving professional. So I can imagine that she was extremely capable of doing what most people do in a full-time job in a part-time capacity. But I think that certainly, even though you kind of look at, I've certainly looked at it in the past as like part-time jobs being like, well, this is kind of, it's not just kind of picking up the loose ends, and it's not a non-core job. It is actually a job that does have the full responsibilities that go along with it. And having those expectations managed from the very outset is certainly very important to do, and certainly for your superiors and for the rest of the company that you're working with, depending on what your responsibilities are. I think it's tricky for some people to find these jobs. Is one thing that has come to my attention in the past. It's like I've kind of working with, and the person I was just mentioning there, trying to find a CISO job, for example, that is part-time. That's a tricky fix. That's a tricky ask. It's like, wow, this is going to be a challenge. Now, they are out there, but they're a little bit more few and far between. But we do tend to see them a little bit more, and I think you'll agree, in the whole HR space. Knowing, like, from my experience as a recruiter, a lot of the time I'd be speaking to the HR person within an organization, or the recruiter within an organization, and they would be part-time in there. What is it about that kind of world that makes it a little bit easier or more commonplace to do your job in a part-time capacity, do you think?
That's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that is interesting about the field of HR is that it is not that it's a bonus function of an organization, but it isn't the first function of an organization when you're building a company, right? So typically speaking, if you are building a company, you have some sort of product or a service and you're trying to sell it. So the first people that you're going to hire are going to be people that somehow have this product or service that you're delivering, and then people that are going to go out and sell that product. If you can't sell the product, you're not going to make any money, right? So the HR function is not necessarily the first function. You might have accountants that you outsource. You can outsource payroll quite easily. So there's a lot of elements of an HR. And you can use recruiters, right, to do the recruiting for you initially from the outset, or you can go out and just pay to put up a job spec yourself. It might not be the best job spec ever, but it might do the job, right? And especially in tougher markets, you'll probably get lots of applicants. So it tends to be not until companies grow to a certain size, and I would probably say around 40 to 50 people, that they're really starting to consider actually maybe there's enough HR function in terms of new starters, onboarding. There's now a training need. There's now people progressing within that company into other things that you sort of tend to think, okay, well, maybe we'll hire somebody in HR. But even at that, what can often happen is that function, maybe you start at 30 people, you're like, it'd be great for someone to do a bit of this admin, a bit of the recruitment. There's sometimes some contracts that we just have to make sure we get right. So it'd be great if someone knew about employment law or something like that. And oftentimes you might look at that role and say, actually, do you know what it is? Just 3 days a week. And then as that company grows, that potential might grow into 5 days a week. But I think because it is sometimes one of the later functions in an organization, it can start with that part-time capacity for sure. Even I'm thinking of one example where I worked, we hired a training coordinator to work in down in the factory, and mostly her job actually was to make sure that we had the SOPs set up, that training reporting was done, that everything was ready for the audits. And the need really came out of this requirement from one of our customers to have auditing done at a certain standard. And part of that meant that the people who were currently working in HR and in the quality team really didn't have the extra 20 hours a week to get to that standard that one of our customers wanted. So we hired somebody in as a training coordinator to manage that within the HR function. Now, as all things do, the better she made it, it kind of grew legs, and then it was sort of a bit like, well, actually, we also need this and this and this, and that job. I did the job for a while, and it almost turned out to be a 5-day-a-week job, and you could have made it that. But it was also quite possible to do the minimum of the audit standards to that part-time standard as well.
Yeah, and it's something that I've seen. I know people that work within this kind of area, certainly from a lot of my friends and colleagues back within the recruitment area, working in the HR space, and there is a lot of a requirement for this, and there's a lot of scope for being able to enter into these roles in a part-time capacity. In terms of the roles, when somebody's looking for a role, when somebody is say somebody's in a part-time situation, say that they are a mother or a father, or that they've got childcare responsibilities and they only want to work a part-time role. Maybe they've been lucky enough to get one already, but they want to move. How easy is it, in your experience, for somebody to move within a part-time capacity and still maintain the level of work-life balance that they need to have? Like how easy is it to think?
So I do think that actually in a lot of ways, I would imagine that it's probably easier almost to find other part-time roles in a different company. It's quite hard, I think, to sort of say, actually, do you know what, I have been doing this full-time role, but I'd really like to do it part-time, because you have had full-time role responsibilities. So those are going to have to go somewhere, unless the company's kind of willing to say, actually, do you know what, we don't necessarily need these things. These are considered kind of added bonuses, but they're not the core functions of the role. And I think that's sometimes where HR can sometimes have that advantage of reducing their role to a part-time function as well, because there are the things that are going to keep you out of the courts and keep things ticking over that you can do in a part-time capacity. But what you might not be doing is doing that added value extra performance management levels, additional training, all of that kind of stuff that comes with the function. And sometimes companies might be willing to go without that. So I would say that like there are lots of part-time jobs out there. They do get advertised on regular job boards. There are sometimes agencies as well that do work more with kind of part-time roles. So there are part-time jobs. I think that when companies think about a part-time job, they do think about it in quite a lot of detail. I think a lot of people recognize that there is a difficulty with constraining part-time work into part-time work. So if you're going to be offering that job, companies do think about it. But I think as well, if you do see those part-time jobs, it is your interview process needs to be, you need to really be assessing the reality of that part-time role as well. And I think that is very much on the candidate to be looking at that and saying, do you already employ part-time people? How do they find their work-life balance? Are there busy times of the year? And it's about making sure that if you do go into these part-time roles to be successful, you need to work out, how do I manage the expectations of my manager and the people that I'm working with, but how do I maximize my own presence for when there are busy periods, that I am actually present for those periods. And I only want to work 3 days a week, and Wednesdays are the busiest days. So me saying I want to work Monday, Thursday, Friday doesn't really add that much value. Whereas if I turn up on the Wednesdays, which are busy, then that's really maximizing my part-time time in a sense. So I think it's a little bit about working that out as well.
Yeah, finding the right match. I think certainly it's not just a case of finding a part-time job that happens to be within your field and then going
Absolutely.
for it. There has to be an extra level of compatibility, I think, which is important.
Yeah.
And I think I wonder like what the thoughts is, because you touched on it just then about like, you know, going from a full-time job and then reducing it to a part-time job. Mm-hmm. There are still the responsibilities of a full-time job that were there. I wonder what the thoughts are. Maybe you have some thoughts on this about people that have gone in with a full-time job. They have done that job day after day after day, and they've got it down so that they can actually, you know, we talked about this before about how you have the ability, like when you first start a job, it takes you twice as long to do a simple thing as it does when you've been doing it for 3 or 4 years, you know. Mm-hmm. And I kind of think to myself, I wonder if there is actually a kind of a specific level of attention or a specific requirement that is given for people that are experienced in roles, that once they've kind of gotten past the initial kind of breaking in period where they've got like, I understand the processes, the systems, now that I am here, I can do what was maybe a permanent full-time function in a part-time capacity, because I am very experienced in this. And it's not, you know, it then makes me kind of think about like, you know, the whole area of non-career changes. So like, you know, you're not kind of branching off from one into another, but coming into something where you have that experience. And I think that is something that is important for businesses to recognize, is that you're not, if you're looking at like, you know, we've been speaking, I've had lots of roles where I've been working, they've gone, oh actually, do you know what, we've lost budget for it, or we're not sure we need it anymore, so we're going to cancel the role. And that happens quite a lot. And one of the things I like now in retrospect think it should have been maybe a conversation, and I don't know whether you've seen this, is should we just take this as a part-time role? Like if we don't really, if we're concerned about the budget we've got for a full-time role, could we get somebody who's experienced but that can do this in a part-time capacity?
Absolutely.
And therefore meet us, you know, and I wonder if that is something that quite often gets overlooked in companies, and you know, whether or not they consider that.
I think that sometimes it's interesting because I you know, money is, as always, is one of the biggest pushers of change, right? So if you're working, and especially like, I mean, maybe it's very relevant now that we're working in a time where a lot of companies are concerned about budgets and they're concerned about forecasts and meeting you know, their deadlines. That actually, do you know, if you go into your company today and you know that there's been reductions, that people have lost working hours during COVID, and you actually say, do you know what, I've been able to sit down and I've looked at my workload. These are the things that I know have to get done. These are things over the next 6 months to a year that I know are prioritized in terms of projects or just daily administration or whatever it is. There's these kind of additional like bonus functions of the role, or these things that actually, if you spread them out between the 5 other members of the team, would probably add an hour to their workload a week. But that's kind of it if they really needed to do it. But potentially you could pay me half my salary, right? And I could only come in for 2.5 days a week, is that something that is maybe workable? And I would imagine that for in some cases, absolutely that is something that would be possible. I'm even thinking actually that, you know, my first job that I had out of college was as a training coordinator for a business, and part of the function of that role was it was very European centered. They were rolling out this whole new system, and I had to deliver all this training across Europe. And obviously, once the system had been implemented, that training kind of wound down and there was significantly less to do. Also combined with the fact that the longer I was there, the better I got at it, the more efficient I got at actually doing all of my tasks. So once I'd been there for about a year, it was kind of like, well, we've sort of done the implementations. I've done the bulk of the work. This job is winding down into not so much a full-time role anymore. And actually what ended up happening is the other training coordinator role in the bakery, the woman who was in that left. So I took that role on and worked both roles part-time. So I would spend 2 days in one role and 3 days in the other role. So for about 6 to 8 months, I think I essentially worked 2 part-time jobs. When I actually left that to a different job, neither of those roles continued to exist. So things are very fluid in that sense. Like I went into a part-time role, made it a full-time role, made it a part-time role, added another part-time role, left both those roles, went into another full-time role. And it was all about the more I did it, the quicker I got at it. And then it was kind of like, well, actually, we don't really need this anymore. So those things do happen all the time in businesses, you know. And that was a great cost saving for them. They were like, we've just paid one person to do 3 different jobs, you know. So
and I think, I mean, the only time where I can look at it and see a downside to it is the availability, is the expectation side of it. Because obviously, for somebody that wants a part-time job, it's not a downside to get one. You know, I think for that it suits the lifestyle that you're after. You obviously you don't apply, you don't tend to end up in a part-time job, put it that way. It's always something that you pursue. And I think the hardest part of it must be the whole managing of the expectations, as we've already spoken about. And I think that at company level, at the level of origin, or the point of origin, needs to be well established. Because I know just during the time I was doing recruitment, the very few roles that I worked on that were part-time, there were some of them that had everything that you would expect of a full-time person to be doing, but also in volume as well. And it was just like, where is the kind of the difference in this job between a part-time job and the full-time version of this? And that had to be something that was looked at. But I think it is certainly something that where people can say, do you know what, this we could actually pay somebody part-time for this, and that is a very good saving exercise, cost saving exercise, but also a way of getting what you want before being able to take on like the full-time person in that position.
Yeah. And I think, even in terms of those expectations, I think it is important, because oftentimes these part-time role descriptions, unless that role's existed in the company previously, the person writing it has this idea that certain things might not take that much time, right? And because they're not the ones necessarily doing the job, and they're kind of like, well, there's this many duties, it probably is, you could probably do it in 3 days a week. Now, as we said a lot already just in this webinar, is that, by the time it takes a bit of time to work out a job, and you can spend a lot longer in the first month or so trying to figure out what you're doing than it actually takes you once you know. So I think sometimes in those part-time roles, it can feel in the beginning very much like you've got this full-time job to do, but the reality is that actually in a full-time job you've got 2 full-time jobs to do, and that's what it feels like for a while. So I think it's important to, if you do go get one of these part-time jobs, and if the work does seem to be a bit overwhelming and to be more of it, that's just something that you need to start logging and tracking and working out, well, what is taking me so long, and figuring out what the priority is, but also accepting that you will get faster at it, and that maybe the job doesn't feel like a part-time job for the first 4 weeks or even 6 weeks, but as you progress, you will work that out so that it does become a part-time job. But at the same time, those expectations need to be shared with a manager. Don't work the 5 days a week if that's not what you're being asked to do, but it does need to be made clear that I am still learning how to do this job. Everything is not getting done, perhaps initially, but don't self-assess that too much, because everyone feels like that in a new job.
Yeah, yeah. And so then in terms of, like, you know, we mentioned obviously the ability for somebody who's experienced in a role to be able to genuinely come in and say, I can squeeze this job in half, do it part time. We're talking about new people to a new field, but they still need the part-time hours. How do we kind of what would be the advice or the approach, I suppose, to somebody that is fresh to the field, is maybe they have done a course or they've got some academics behind them that's going to suit them to be able to do what they're looking to do, but they are still going to be brand new to a field that they're looking to take on as a part-time job? What is the approach that works best in that sort of situation or scenario?
The approach to working, or the approach to kind of getting the job? I suppose they're different.
I think the approach to getting the job, first of all, I would say is the main. I think for me, I think in terms. Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, because I think like we have a very good ability to look around us and find adverts online. We know it's the commonplace thing that we do all the time is to get up to speed with the latest job sites, and you know, get our alerts set up, and we apply to these jobs and that kind of thing. And even if it's a full-time network, we're always talking about the whole networking opportunities and the way, like, you know, getting into stuff like that. In terms of doing a new entrant to a market in a part-time capacity, I think there has to be a massive emphasis on the networking side of things. About, like, you know, the internal referral, like, because I think that's going to be the easier way for you to land a job in a part-time capacity, especially if you're new to the field. And whereas if you've got somebody that can vouch for you and say, look, this person is brand new, but they are very good, they pick up stuff so quickly, I know it's a part-time role, blah blah blah, they'd be very good for it, you need to speak to them. I think that's going to give you a much more reliable route into getting a job like that than it would be from straight up application.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, and also people that are changing careers, it's like you need to remember how big your networks really are. And it might have been a while since you've been in a situation where you've had to think, oh my goodness, I'm networking, right? And maybe that is something that you do have to get your head around a little bit, and just put out that network map and just start writing down names of people that you know. The other thing I would say is actually do a bit of research on the types of companies that would be, I guess, maybe have a history of hiring people who are career changers, or who hire people who are part-time workers. There are a lot of companies, well, maybe not a lot, but there are companies around who do programs for people returning to work, and who understand that flexibility, and who want to get mothers in particular back into the workplace after taking a career break. So those types of companies that already have those programs in place, and who have an HR team who are very aware of the challenges of balancing work and life and all of that kind of stuff, are more likely to have policies already in place in the company that support part-time workers, that are understanding of those different needs, that ensure that you do go home at 5 o'clock rather than working until 9 o'clock to cover those extra hours. So I think in those companies, you do have a much higher chance. And then it's just about, on your CV, going back to, as we said last week, talking about using those transferable skills, and really highlighting that, okay, you might have some learning to do in terms of the new skills that you've picked up in a course, but actually your ability to you know, persuade people that they need to do things, to communicate with others in different teams, even just understanding generally how a business works. All of those skills that you've had in a previous job are going to make you able, or better able, to fit in quite quickly than someone who hasn't worked before. So I think it is a little bit of a mixture of use your network, really research and try and understand, figure out, like, companies put up values all the time. And if they have programs that are about getting people to return to work, or they support, you know, people who are career changers, or they support people working part-time, those are definitely excellent companies to reach out to. And if you have somebody that works in somewhere like that, that's a really good use of your network. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's something that's very important for anybody to do anyway, whether it's full-time or part-time, but certainly when it comes to the part-time capacity, because of the nature of the landscape of the job market out there, you know, that there is so many more full-time positions out there to take advantage of, that it is very important, I think, to kind of you know, make sure you do take advantage of that particular approach, and to kind of make it your kind of your key strategy, you know, and not a secondary thing, but make it a key route in.
And I'm thinking also, sorry. The other thing I was going to say is to maybe, even before you're thinking about applying for part-time work, I know that we're all working from home at the minute, but I think that they're also just in your own kind of framing of like, what is the situation that I'm in and what do I really need, you know? And I have worked with someone before who the role was actually advertised as a 5-day-a-week role. It typically would have been in the office all 5 days of the week. The person who actually ended up getting the role, she ended up only working 4 days a week, and 2 of them in the office and 2 of them at home, because she had 2 younger kids. So sometimes just being upfront and saying, well, look, I absolutely understand what the job is asking. And going back to that experience level and saying, well, the job is saying it's this, this, and this. In an interview, I understand that this is going to take roughly this time that you use these systems. I'm going to have to communicate with X, Y, and Z, and that's probably going to be really busy on Mondays and Tuesdays. I might have to be talking to people in the UK, and that works best on Thursdays, or whatever it is, and figure all of that kind of stuff out, and then come back with a proposal saying, well, I really think that can I do this job in maybe 4 days rather than 5? Is it important that I only have to come into the office? So I don't have to worry about dropping kids to 7 different places in the morning. And actually, if I could just work at home and have a longer, flexible day, that would also be fine. And I think there's a huge difference between both, like that flexible working idea and part-time working, and understanding which of those it is that you want. It is quite important because it can matter, and it can definitely change how you approach sending in a job application, and just being upfront with the reality of it. And there might be companies who are willing to flex a little bit. You know, they're not going to change a 5 day a week, a 40-hour job into a 20-hour job, but there might be some wiggle room in how you work to get what's required done, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And so then, in terms of the person that's starting this new job, like, you know, they've gone through this whole process, they've got they've got the yes, they've got their start date. How do you think their approach to a new job differs from the approach to a job of? We've talked about the setting boundaries, obviously. Is there anything that you kind of think in terms of how they should approach their new job that would differ from how somebody in a full-time capacity would approach starting a new job?
So I think so we've obviously talked about like the boundaries and the prioritizing. I think that there is an importance as well to not kind of emotionally assess yourself too much, especially if this is something that maybe you aren't coming directly back from maternity leave or anything like that, but maybe it's more like you have taken a break, and the scheduling of your life and pace of your life has different ups and downs than it's going to in a job capacity. So I think it's quite easy, or is more likely to happen in a part-time role where you're kind of going in and stressing about trying to get all of these expectations done, but you're only in for a few hours, and you're trying to work out, well, this day I'm in and this day I'm off, and you've now got 2 rhythms that you're trying to balance. And I think that it can be there can be a tendency, I think, for part-time workers to come in and say, this just isn't going to work. And to be like, I can't do this. It's too difficult. Can't sync up anything. It's all very stressful. And then just to end up actually leaving. So I think maybe it's important to emotionally just be aware that maybe don't jump to a conclusion about the role based on how you feel for a couple of weeks until you've managed to sync up the rhythm of life and the rhythm of work, you know?
I think very valuable. I think one of the things I was thinking in terms of it is that because of the amount that you're going to try and achieve within your workspace there, you know, I think one of the things that differs for people that are working part-time to the people that are working full-time is the ability to be known in the business. And to establish yourself as part of the business is a very difficult thing for people that are part-time, because I think a lot of people, and I might be wrong, but I think a lot of people that are coming in a part-time capacity are really focused on justifying their existence and getting in there and doing the job and getting it all done, and then, you know, that's the priority. And it is, you know, I get it, it should be the priority, but I think when that is your priority and you might not have much let up in your day because of that, you know, there'd be a very easy inclination to ignore the in-work socialization side of things. So ignore the part where you're kind of going to the break room, or you're making a point of getting yourself known by one department or another department, you know. And I think this is something that's really important for part-time workers, is that make sure you get your face seen, make sure people know what your name is and what you do, and the fact that you're there part-time. You know, I was very impressed with one company that I worked with in my recruitment days, who I would phone them up and I would say, is XYZ there? And they would say, oh no, she's part-time, so she only works up until 1 o'clock. She would have gone home by now. And this would have been somebody out on the floor that not related to HR, not in that department at all. They'd just gone, they know who she is, they know she's part-time, it's 1 o'clock, you're not going to get hold of her. And it's just like, well, that's good that they all know, you know. And I think that's a very important thing. Not just necessarily from the information relay point of view, but for that person to be known as part of that team, for that person to be, like, you know, established in that area. So I think if you're starting a part-time job, yes, you definitely should be trying to make sure you get all your work-related stuff done, and that you are seen to be coping, because, like, at the end of the day, we're being paid to do something rather than be mates with people. But at the same time, you will find that your job become a much more integral part of the business, and much more you know, part of that team, when people know who you are and know what you do. And you've kind of just taken, even if you've just said to yourself, right, you know, set yourself a target of like meeting 2 people a day, or like, you know, introducing yourself to 2 people a day. You know, it's 5 minutes out of a schedule that might be, you know, you might have to actually put 5 minutes into your schedule to say, right, I actually have to go off and speak to new people now and make sure they know who I am, and then come back. But I think that is something that needs to become a part of a part-time worker's day, as opposed to a full-time worker who probably will end up taking a lunch break and meeting people anyway, or, you know, it's quite easily a part of your day when you're full-time, but not so much part-time.
Yeah, and I think I was just going to say, like, we kind of talked about this, like, being present when it matters, and I think that ties in with that idea, right? Is that it's really important as a part-time person to be seen as being present, because the last thing that you want in the business is for everyone to be like, God, I just have no idea when Jen's in, and every time I want her, she's not there. And it's like, well, you just always seem to want me on a Tuesday, and I don't work Tuesdays, and I've been here a year and you haven't figured that out yet, you know? So, like, I think that kind of communication and being present with those people that you're going to be potentially working with, or people who might need stuff from you, and being really like, I am 100% here on Mondays and Wednesdays and Thursdays, and they know that, as you said, it's very easy for them to just adjust their work so that they can talk to you and then be like, it's fine, Jen's not here on Tuesdays. But to be present when it works for other people, and if it doesn't work for other people, to actually build that relationship so that you can make it work, is more important. Because and I've worked with part-time people where it's just been so frustrating, because you're like, I just never understand when they're here. And I'm always late on something because every time I want it, they just don't seem to be here. And it feels like they're more absent than not, which isn't really the case, but it's just a matter of being upfront about the fact that you work part-time, and when you are in the office, being in the office, you know, and taking those 5 minutes.
Yeah. And how does it work, do you think, for, like, we've mentioned already, the going from full-time and maybe taking that role and saying, look, I can do this in half the time now, let's make it a part-time job because that's what I need. Do you ever see, or have you ever seen before, where somebody has been part-time and for whatever reason, you know, that their circumstances have changed, maybe kids have grown up, or maybe their circumstances have altered, and they want to now make a part-time job a full-time job? What's the challenges there? Like, what challenges do people encounter?
Well, I think so. The obvious challenge, well, there's a few obvious challenges, is that, like, the scope of the role that you currently have, you've been able to do in a part-time capacity, and they've been paying you for that, right? So no one's going to suddenly be like, okay, we'll keep your job spec the same and we'll just pay you double and you can kind of turn up a little bit longer, right? So I think from that, it's always going to be very difficult to increase the scope of your role into a full-time role unless something comes up that gives you that, like, kind of addition. I think that there is, I'm trying to think if I've seen that happen. And I think it does happen in some spaces, you know, like you can get the timing right if there's projects and stuff coming up where you can be like, actually, there's this thing coming up, I'd like to get involved with it. I know it's going to last 6 months. I'm happy to go back to doing full time and kind of take advantage. And there are industries where those types of projects will come up with frequency. So it's not like you're sitting there waiting for ages or anything like that, but where that maybe is an opportunity to increase the amount that you work. And then what you can always say is that we'll do the project and then can we just reassess? Because the reality is that you think that you might want to go full time, but until you do it, you know, you might, just for your own sort of security in a way, it's like there's no harm saying, you know, I'd love to be honest, we know that this is going to be a 3 to 6 month thing. I'd love to be doing it for that time. And then can we sit down and chat about if there is a full-time opportunity after that? But really make sure that you have that discussion, because I think that, you know, it is any transition is different, and you do want to have that. Did this transition work for me, and is this something that I want to continue?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one of the things I was thinking, obviously budget becomes, you know, an issue, like as you've already said. You've already proven that you can do this job part-time, so why pay you full-time? I think that one of the keys to it is to plan ahead for it, especially if there's growth in the area that you're in. So like if you're in an HR capacity, or maybe you're in a cybersecurity capacity, or anything really where your company is growing and there is eventually going to be need to bring on an assistant for you, or somebody else to kind of back up what you're doing because the workload's growing so much. And I think in terms of what you would be looking for yourself in that sense, I think it's good to kind of look ahead to the future always and say, like, you know, always just be planning ahead, like 1 or 2 years ahead, going, right, where do I see myself being in the next year? And I don't mean like that in the interview question, like, where do you see yourself? I mean, like, in terms of like the actual, like, what do I see myself personally, academically, professionally, all those kind of areas of your life? Where do you see it going in a year's time? Do you want to go full time, or maybe you're full time? Do you want to go part time in a year's time? Like, you know, how is it going to work for you? And keeping that in mind, and then it's going to be much easier for you then to transition within, you know. Now, of course, the easiest way for somebody who's part-time to go into a full-time job is just to move and go into a full-time job. That's the easy one. But if you're in a company that you like and you want to stay there, then it does require a little bit of forward planning, because like, you want to make sure that's an option. So I think that's, as well, like, that's probably
just on that kind of planning thing, like, you know, it's always amazing to me in some ways how many people actually would love to go back and do a master's maybe and work part-time, and that might be somebody in your own department. And if you're working part-time in that department, you know, maybe talk to your manager, because that manager might know that these 3 people actually would love to go part-time, but you can't really let them go part-time because there's too much of their work. But perhaps if you were thinking, you know, in the future, maybe next year I'd love to think about going full time, then start assessing like what skills it is that you need to do to maybe cover someone else's job. And maybe that's a really easy, it might actually just work out real straightforward that this person gets to do their part-time thing and you take over their job, and then you do that for a year, and then you work out where everybody is in terms of full-time working again. But as you said, that kind of planning and just communicating that that's what you want is really, really key. I think for anybody who's looking for jobs, if you keep it to yourself, it's never going to work out for you, right? Because no one knows that that's what you're looking for. Whereas saying, I'd love to be moving full time. Can you see any ways that I could transition into a different department? Might there be opportunities coming up in a year's time? Do I have the skill sets for it? Is there stuff that I should be doing in the next year to make sure that I could actually apply for that full-time role, if it's a new role potentially, and get yourself that internal job move, but don't wait until the job comes up and then be like, oh God, suddenly I want to do this, you know?
Yeah. And this is the thing, that it is the forward thinking kind of approach, where you just need to know in advance what you're looking to do. You know, I think if you're kind of waiting until you want it in order to change, like, you know, or to start like you know, networking and things, you've got a long road ahead of you, or a very tough road ahead of you in that sense. And I think that's a very important thing to be aware of. But yeah, I think it's actually a very kind of not very much talked about. It's not talked about the whole part-time world within the careers market, certainly within recruitment, is not a lot of recruiters get the call for, certainly in my old company anyway, for the part-time role. We would only have a handful of them come across every so often, certain specific roles. But it is something that I think we do need to kind of open more doors for, I think, in the kind of professional network in the professional world, especially in areas where companies are kind of going, we can't really afford this particular position at the moment. I think that the knowledge of how many people are out there looking for part-time roles is completely that they're very different kind of ends to themselves. I think people would be astonished at how many people are out there that would do something in a part-time capacity, providing things marry up. And I think that's a really important thing for organizations to be aware in that capacity as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even the idea that you might get organizations typically would be like, we have all of these full-time roles and we might have a part-time role, but within a function, could you maybe just have 3 part-time roles? Does all of those specific skill sets that you're looking for, do they all need to be full-time jobs actually? And I think that's kind of where you get into and even like job sharing is something that commonly happens when people come back, especially from maternity leave, is that they try and come back part-time and then they share part of their job with somebody else. And I think that those types of more flexible options and more creative options of why is the standard job 35 to 40 hours a week? Like why do we think that that's the measure of what a job is at all to begin with? So maybe that's something that as an industry, or just in Ireland, we need to think about it a little bit more, is what are we measuring our work in, and why is our baseline unit 40 hours? And there's so many times that we try to stick within these kind of not socially acceptable but professionally acceptable standards, like the job spec. It's just like, well, we really want this person to only do 5 things, but our job spec needs to have at least 20 things on it in order to look like a good job. And it's just like, why? Or else it's not worth presenting to the board. And justifying the job. If you've got a need and if the need only caters for 6 hours a day, then that's the new job. Like, why are you creating something to add into it? Now, I'm not particularly well knowledgeable in the area of HR and the regulations that surround that kind of area. So maybe there are reasons, like legally, that a person has to be paid full-time hours or whatever. I don't know why, but you do raise a very good point. It's just like, well, if the job can be done in 6 hours a day, then why do we not advertise it as being a 6 hour a day job? Is it because it just seems less acceptable to somebody else, or because they'll be branded part-time and they don't want it, or is it what is the reason behind it? And sometimes I think it's literally just because we don't have, or organizations really don't have the time to consider anything else outside of like half hours or full-time hours. And I think it's a good idea for people to start thinking in that manner, just because you'll attract so many more people, fill those roles and meet your own business need without spending the same amount of money that another business who are doing that in a full-time role will end up spending out. So I think it's a really important thing for organizations to consider, is that how long do we really need somebody to be doing this, and not to kind of do it in, well, we think you can probably squeeze it into 6 hours, so we're only going to pay you for 6 hours. We don't want to kind of start a culture. But the reality is that we have exactly this amount of work that is not getting done. And this is the same idea where contractors come from, right? And we're seeing this kind of general increase in the amount of contract work, is that people are like, we have a lot of business happening right now, so we're going to need a lot more people for the next 6 to 18 months. But we definitely don't want to suddenly have 70 full-time employees when in 2 years' time we might only have work for 40 of them. That'd be crazy. So it's just about trying to reframe, like, what do we actually need? And I think maybe being a little bit more comfortable around it being something other than the total norm, because there are a lot of people that I do think want those reduced hours of work, who are coming back into the workplace, maybe, have, or even people that maybe have like retired in some sense. And I've actually worked with someone who was retired, went back into business because he was like, actually, I'm 55. What am I doing? Being retired, I'm running around the place. What am I doing being retired? I really like having the freedom to go play my golf on a Wednesday or whatever. So I don't really want to give that up. But actually, like, if there was a job where I could do things that I'm good at for 10 hours a week just to keep my mind going, that'd be amazing, you know? So like there's so many of those people that just might have that need and want to go to work even without it being a financial need necessarily.
No, that's brilliant, actually. It's really important, I think, to make sure that you've kind of you are getting what you want, but you're not feeling what's the word, not marginalized, but you're not feeling like a second-class worker because you're not working full-time. It's like, you know, you have to do what you're doing for your own business, for your own needs, for your own wants. And I think we've already talked about, like, you know, the work-life balance side of things, but this kind of relates quite closely to it. You know, it's just like, well, you know, why are you working? Is it because you should work, or are you working to enable yourself to have a good life, or for some other reason? You know, and people have different reasons. You know, some people work is different to them to something else, but certainly being somebody that works part-time or full-time shouldn't really be something that, you know, you consider yourself to be one level of professional above another one. You know, it should be like,
absolutely not. Actually, you know, like that person that I was thinking about there, it was like, well, he just came in on a Monday and he got all of this stuff done that actually the rest of us just like didn't really have time, you know, like, and actually he was like the most valuable person in the team in a way, because we were like, oh my goodness, you turn up on Monday and you sort all of our stuff out and we're all a disaster without you, and you have all this experience. So when we get stuck on something, you're like our go-to. How does this, have you ever heard of that thing before? What is this thing about? You know, like, and so actually these roles aren't necessarily less valuable or more administrative or rubbish or anything like that. They can be incredibly valuable and people can really value them, but they do have to just be set up like that. You know. Yeah.
I think that is really important, but like that's you've hit the nail exactly on the head there. It's just like it doesn't really matter how long it takes you to do something. It's your ability to do it within the time that you've said you're going to do it in, and that is what ends up becoming making somebody very valuable, no matter how many hours they're working with you or not working with you, as the case may be. You know, that's really important, I think.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we wrap it up there. Do we have any more final thoughts?
No, I don't think I have anything else to add. I think I've, for the first time in my life, I think I've actually said everything I need to say.
Okay, well then we will quickly sign off before Dale thinks of something else he'd like to contribute. So thank you everybody so much for listening to this week's podcast. Hopefully you enjoyed it. We will be back next week with Career Conversations, so tune in for episode 5 and we'll see you later. So thanks so much, Dale.
Thanks, Jen. Cheers. Bye.